Hi everyone, and a very warm welcome to this latest Euronews virtual debate. Nice to see you with us this afternoon. My name is Damon Embling. I'm a journalist with Euronews, and I got the great pleasure of moderating and hosting this event for the next 60 minutes or so. So the big question we're asking this afternoon is profit versus public good. How can innovation benefit everyone? So a good tech and innovation themed hour coming up for you. We've got a great panel of guests lined up to discuss this question. Without further ado, let's bring in our guests and say hello to them. First of all, let's go over to Bern in Switzerland and say hi to Annelies Eggermann, who's the CEO of InnoSwiss, which is the Swiss innovation agency. Hi to you, Annelies.
Hello, Damon. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Looking forward to your contribution today. Also in Switzerland, in Lausanne, we've got Tommaso Di Giovanni, who's the Vice President of International Communications at Philip Morris International, or PMI. Hi to you, Tommaso.
Hello, Damon. Hi, everyone. And thank you for hosting this debate. I hope it's going to be interesting for everyone.
Thanks for joining us from Switzerland as well. Let's cross over to Madrid in Spain and say hi to Elena Bo, who's the Innovation Director at EIT InnoEnergy, who's focused on innovation in the energy transition. Hi to you, Elena.
Hi, Damon. It's a great pleasure to be here with all the colleagues to discuss this passionate topic.
Great to see you. Thanks for joining us from Madrid this afternoon. And last but not least, joining us from the UK, where I am also this afternoon, is Andrew Smith, who's a Professor of Consumer Behaviour and Director at the NLab at Nottingham University Business School. Hi to you, Andrew.
Good afternoon, everybody. And again, pleased to be here and hopefully have a lively, interesting discussion.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. So I'll be coming back to my guests in just a moment or so. If you have any questions for anybody that you're seeing on the screen today, any of our panelists, do leave them in the chat section just below the video screen where you're watching, and I'll get those questions to our panelists a bit later on. But what are we exactly talking about then? Profit versus public good. How can innovation benefit everyone? Well, tech and innovation is everywhere we go today, isn't it? It's part of our lives, whether we know about it or not. Take the pandemic, for example. It's been a big part of that speedy development of vaccines and their rollouts around the world. And also technology, for example, is getting us on the move again with travel. It's making travel possible after all those complications caused by the pandemic. Innovation is certainly fueling global economies, and it should be making our lives better, right? That's the theory. But actually, is it all about companies just making profits? Are companies really in it for the public good? Can you have profit and can you have public good? That's the question that we're going to be asking and discussing with our great lineup of guests you can see on the screen here. So let's kick things off. Let's go first of all to Annelies Eggermann, CEO of InnoSwiss, joining us from Switzerland today. Annelies, you're a federal agency there, sort of working in the science sector with SMEs, small businesses, innovation startups, all those sorts of things to kind of, make sure that innovation happens. But first of all, before we talk about the kind of stuff that you're doing there, how would you define good innovation? I mean, it seems like a simple question, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and the answer may be quite difficult. But I would say in a general way, good innovation is innovation that benefits society as a whole. And that's very often the case. You already mentioned examples. So the vaccines we have, we got in a very short time against the pandemic. And there are a lot of examples that show that innovation benefits really society.
Okay, Elena Bo from EIT InnoEnergy. You're in the area of work that's the kind of topic of the moment, if you like, climate, the energy transition. Obviously, a lot of innovation going on in that sector right now. How would you define innovation in the work that you do?
Thank you for the question. How I would define innovation in this sector? In our case, it has a lot to do with the mission, because we define EIT InnoEnergy like the leading innovation engine in sustainable energy. But innovation has to have a purpose. And what is the purpose? And I think that is very connected with the mission. We are here to support and to encourage energy transition. So this means somehow that we have to support with that innovation to make the energy more affordable, more accessible, and also more sustainable. So any innovation that fulfill any of those criteria for us would be a good innovation, something that it is worth to be considered and to be fostered.
Okay, Elena, let's go over to Tommaso Di Giovanni, who's from PMI, Philip Morris International, obviously a tobacco giant. I mean, you guys are going through a massive transformation at the moment, developing what you call a smoke-free future. I mean, you're innovating in a sector that has historically stood still for many, many years, right?
Yes, look, let's face it, cigarettes used to be our core product, and everyone knows that cigarettes cause diseases. So let's start from this point. And as you say, cigarettes haven't changed in almost 2 centuries. I mean, there's been very little innovation that happened in that industry, and it's a shame to a large extent. But the truth is, until the end of the 90s, the beginning of the years 2000, the science, the technology weren't there to come up with better alternatives that people would enjoy, because that's part of the challenge. Instead, after the years 2000, we realized that finally providing smokers who don't quit, because quitting remains the best thing they can do, is possible. And it's possible because we realized the vast majority of the harmful compounds found in smoke come from combustion, so eliminating combustion sounded like the most promising way to do that. And we, as a company, committed to put all our resources behind that goal. But we can talk about it later. I don't want to take more time at this stage.
Yeah, certainly, Tommaso. We're going to be talking about that smoke-free vision and all the sort of challenges and the R&D that goes around that. I just want to bring in Andrew Smith, first of all, Professor of Consumer Behaviour at Nottingham University Business School. Andrew, from a sort of consumer perspective, from a society perspective, when do we really care about innovation and technology? I mean, do we really take notice of what companies and government organisations are doing? Or is it just a case, yeah, we do take notice when it hits our pocket?
Well, we do take notice because we buy and consume things that help us live our lives. And the way that we use those things determine whether they bring about psychological well-being, whether they're good for us in other ways. So we might buy, a dangerous car would be an obvious example. We don't want a car that's dangerous. We want a car that's safe. We want a car that's good for our well-being and increasingly good for society. So I think people do care about the extra, the other layers around a product rather than just what it does for them in their life. So yeah, and increasingly so.
And do you think consumers do accept that actually businesses, they have to be in it for profit and public good, or do you think that they don't even think about that sort of thing?
I think people do think about that because they put companies under pressure for various reasons. And I think companies can do both. We've got lots of pro-social enterprises at the moment. I won't give too many examples, but there are companies out there who are, they're really, one of the driving factors is to improve the environment. And yes, they're doing it for profit. They're working profit into their model, but they're very much there to achieve some good. Obviously, there are other examples of companies that are very profit-driven and not so attendant to those issues.
Okay, Andrew, thank you very much indeed for now. To our audience, if you're just joining us, thank you very much indeed for tuning into this live Euronews debate, profit versus public good. How can innovation benefit everyone? If you have any questions for any of the panelists that you can see on the screen, do send those in through the comment section just below the video screen where you're watching, and we'll get those to our panelists a bit later on. Tommaso, I'd like to go back to you at PMI in Switzerland. You mentioned a few minutes ago about this smoke-free vision that you have for Philip Morris International, obviously traditionally a tobacco giant. You're obviously working in the sector of public health, which matters a lot to many people, particularly now, even more so after the pandemic. Critics and skeptics would say, if you generally were concerned about the public health and doing public good, you'd close your company. You wouldn't be developing other products to try and keep your profits up, because some people will be just saying, this is just a case of your company trying to keep the money flowing in, right? It's not about the public good.
Well, unfortunately, things are not as easy. I mean, if even we stopped selling cigarettes tomorrow, we probably wouldn't solve the real issue, which is people would continue to smoke. Others would simply sell that product either legally or illegally. And that's the history of prohibition that we all know doesn't work. Instead, I believe it's time to look at what science, technology, and innovation can do for all those who don't quit smoking. And even the WHO says that regardless of all what's being done to encourage people to quit, or not to start. There will be in 2025 approximately the same number of smokers worldwide as we have today. So look, on our end,
it's a difficult sell, isn't it, Tommaso? It's a difficult sell, no?
It's interesting that you even asked this question, because is it a difficult sell to get away from cars that are fueled by fossil fuels and go to electric? I mean, it's exactly the same principle. If you have products that are a much better option for smokers, why would you not focus on that? And yes, it takes courage, because it would be much easier for us to continue to sell cigarettes. I mean, cigarettes continue to sell. And instead, we made this bold decision to actually commit in front of our investors through a statement of purpose in 2016 to replace all cigarettes with a product that is much more complex to manufacture, that has science behind it, that is much more complex to sell, because selling a product of electronic like a IQOS or selling a cigarette are two different ball games. Think about the after sales support, because we think that's the way to go. And Andrew said something that I agree with before. I mean, profit can go with public good, and this is a typical case of it, because of course we're going to continue growing as a company, and we want to continue growing as a company. But at the same time, we know that by replacing cigarettes with a product that doesn't burn, that generates 95% lower level of harmful compounds, we're also addressing a key question, a key concern from society, which is your product causes diseases, so can you do something about it? And if we marry the two, we're winning on all fronts, right? So
but you're not winning. Well, you're not winning on all fronts around the world right now, are you? It's taking some convincing, and I mean, it's fair to say you're on a bumpy road, right?
Yes. And look, in fairness, I mean, there's an element of innovation that historically is true. Innovation always comes with skepticism. I mean, if you remember what happened to Copernicus, that will tell you a lot. So whenever you come with an innovation, you're disrupting a market. So your competitors may not all appreciate the change you bring in, because you force them to change their business model. There are people who are simply paid to activate some campaigns, for instance, against it. They should have been in favor of public health. Very often they turn into campaigns against the industry. So those people have jobs they need to protect. But in fairness, while it has been challenging to convince everyone, many have changed their mind. And I mean, you sit in the UK. The UK is a place where the government, Public Health England, have taken a clear stance in favor of products that do not burn. They did it before we even could advocate for it, because they know the principle of encouraging smokers to go from cigarettes to better alternatives if they don't quit makes sense for public health. And I can cite the US, who went in the same direction. A couple of weeks ago, New Zealand announced a similar policy. Recently, Egypt, I can name Switzerland, where I sit, recently passed a law that sets different rules for products that do not burn and products that burn. So there is progress. Of course, it takes time. And I mean, innovation always comes before government action. That's a typical sequence that we all see in history. So it shouldn't be different in this case. And I'm confident with time, things will change and smokers will have access to better alternatives everywhere.
Okay, Tommaso from PMI, thanks for that. Let's go back to Annelies Eggermann, the CEO of InnoSwiss, also in Switzerland. Annelies, Tommaso was saying there that innovation comes with skepticism. Would you go along with that?
Well, in a certain extent, yes, of course. But I think innovation is also something people are aiming at. I mean, we want to improve our lives. And if we think 100 years ago how family lived, what the life was, so we have made a huge journey, and we will continue with this journey, and this needs innovation. And in our case, I mean, we are supporting so-called science-based innovation. So we really want to use scientific knowledge to put into practice to improve lives. So of course, innovation has risks. And sometimes these risks go in the wrong direction, so you have side effects you wouldn't like to have. Then, of course, you have to intervene, and I think that's also a task of the public sector to regulate then afterwards and ensure that things go in the right direction. But in the end, I think innovation is just necessary to continue our lives and also to feed the world population, for example.
Okay, and we'll get to regulation actually a bit later on in this debate to discuss a bit about the implications of that and the challenges around that. Let's go back to Elena Bo, who's at EIT InnoEnergy in Madrid in Spain. EIT InnoEnergy is innovating in the field of sustainable energy in the climate change sector. Elena, I don't need to tell you, there's a bit of an energy crisis going on right now, isn't there? I mean, a lot of people, a lot of consumers are worried about their bills going up. A lot of companies are worried about their bills going up. The green transition has been long talked about, and we've heard of lots of innovation over the recent years. But when things like the sort of energy crisis happen, do you think this sort of risks losing the public support for that innovation in your sector? Because people may not think that it's innovating in the right way in terms of delivering public good. Actually, it's penalizing some people.
I think that it is a very complex question because, I mean, that depends on what are the type of glasses that we are wearing. I think that there are some actors that they are trying to point at the energy transition as the guilty one of this kind of situation about the energy prices, and this is unfair in that sense because the energy system and the energy market. It's much more complex, I mean, than that, and it is a question of economics, of offering and demand and supply. It is also about accessibility. I mean, I think that it is also about the gas situation. So I think that on the contrary, I think that at this moment, it is obvious, it is clear that we need much more innovation in order to make to facilitate accessibility. I mean, to make it much more accessible, not to depend on special countries and regions in order to heat our houses, and also that implies that also regulation plays a crucial role, especially in a very regulated market like energy. But on the contrary, we are of the opinion that indeed we need much more innovation to reduce the cost of energy and to make it much more accessible. So this means democratizing the energy.
Okay, Elena, thank you very much indeed. Andrew Smith, Nottingham University Business School, Professor of Consumer Behaviour. When we talk about climate change and the energy transition, obviously, this is a big subject that a lot of people, a lot of consumers and individuals are taking an interest in. We've got the COP meeting coming up in Glasgow very shortly, so it's going to be firmly on the political agenda. Do you think that when things like the energy crisis happens and people hear stories about their energy bills probably going to go up, when they can't really afford it, we have energy poverty, do you think then consumers start to judge actually where this sector is going in terms of its innovation and what it actually is doing for the public good?
Yeah, of course. I mean, some consumers are very hard pressed, and consumers aren't all all concerned about the environment to the same level. We know it's related to education and to social class to an extent, not exclusively, but that there's certainly a relationship there. But across the board, people's concerns, it's whether they can afford those concerns. We know from research that people will often choose cheaper alternatives, even if they say they are environmentally concerned, either because they don't have a choice. It's a time of the month of the pay cycle where they don't have much money, so they choose cheaper options, even though they do have genuine environmental concerns. So, it's quite a complicated question, but yes, I mean, if you've got someone on a limited income, limited disposable income, who's hard pressed economically, and during COVID, that's got very bad for lots of families right across Europe, then those environmental concerns can be put aside to an extent or for a while. They're not necessarily continuous or always there, or always the priority for all consumers. So it depends.
Because actually with the pandemic, we hear that a lot of consumers, apparently, they're looking for more sustainable, responsible companies, products and things. But is it a case when actually they've got less money in their pocket that they sacrifice those kind of thoughts and put them to the back of their mind?
Yes. And they do what we call it. They neutralize it. And we do this all the time with lots of things. We don't sustain consistent ideas on lots of things in our life. And that's another example. We're capable of doing that, and it's not because we're bad. It's because we have other priorities, other genuine priorities in a given time cycle, like being able to put food on the table for our family, or because we're saving up for a car. There might be a number of reasons.
Yeah, coming down to the bare necessities. Thank you very much indeed for that, Andrew. If you're just joining us, welcome along to this Euronews virtual debate. Today we're asking the question, profit versus public good. How can innovation benefit everyone? And if you have a question for any of the panelists that you're seeing this afternoon during this event, we've got about another 40 minutes or so to go yet. If you've got any questions for them, do leave them in the comments section below the video, and we'll get as many of those questions to our panelists before we finish up today. I'd like to go back now to Annelies Eggermann, CEO at InnoSwiss, the Swiss innovation agency in Switzerland. Annelies, when we talk about innovation and technology doing public good, it was interesting, wasn't it? Because we had a briefing call before this debate just to kind of chat through some of the key things that you wanted to say and to discuss. And you were saying actually that private companies are not in business of sort of healing and saving the world. I mean, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think first of all, private companies are here to make profit. They have to be profitable. I mean, this serves society as well because they're also taxpayers. And the public governments need taxes in order to finance their tasks. That's for sure. But on the other hand, of course, they also have a broader responsibility, and I think a lot of companies feel that and take this responsibility. And for example, in our case, when we foster innovation, of course, sustainability is for example, a criteria, and they have to show that their innovation is not harmful, but that it goes in the right direction, saving resources or whatever. So for us, it's a big concern, and I think we see a change in behavior also in companies in the last few years. So for them, sustainability, for example, is much more important. And I think it's not just greenwashing; it's also because it's out of conviction, because they see as well we have to do something in order to guarantee a safe life also in the future. And I think that's a good thing. But nevertheless, I think companies are here to be profitable and to earn money, because if you don't earn money, you can't spend money, and that's important.
Okay,
right.
thank you.
I agree with that. There are sort of legacy companies and legacy products, but there are new products. I think thinking of a digital virtual good, app like Olio, the food sharing app, it's a commercial concern for profit, but it's facilitating reducing food waste and facilitating food sharing. And there's lots of those examples of socially driven for-profit enterprises these days, newer companies. Some of the legacy companies, I think Tommaso has an issue there. That's a legacy product with a big legacy of public bad, and overturning that's very difficult. With new things, genuinely new things, I think it's easier.
And if I may, in our case, you're absolutely right. Legacy is one of the biggest challenges because of the controversies of the past of the industry, because of the fact that the products that we used to sell and we still sell cause serious diseases. And there's another big issue we face. I mean, we talked about consumers. You talked a lot about consumers, and I fully agree with all what you say. Although very often we assume that consumers have all the information needed to make rational choices, the fact of the matter is they not always have all that information. And that is an issue for companies that want to innovate very often, because we inside have a lot of knowledge and expertise, and we can read science and understand it. Very often consumers don't. And I take two examples, one unrelated to our industry on vaccines. If you just read the debate on vaccines, I'm not sure people have all the right information on vaccines. They hear very contradictory things out there. If you talk about our products, there's surveys published by independent survey organizations in France, in the UK, Public Health England was very concerned about that show people still believe nicotine, 50% of people approximately still believe nicotine is the primary cause of smoking-related diseases. That's an issue for innovation. That kind of confusion among consumers, especially in the digital era, becomes a bit of an obstacle. because consumers are not always able to make a really informed choice, and they're subject to very different voices out there.
Yeah. If I can jump there, I agree totally with Tommaso in the sense, especially with climate change also and energy. We are very illiterate in general. I mean, and we need a lot of communication and a lot of pedagogy and a lot of education in order first to have enough information in order to decide. Okay, but there is also a question related with a bit the legacy, but the legacy in innovation related with deep tech and technology. When we are having innovators related with technology, we always think about the TRLs, the famous technology readiness level. And years ago, we introduced this concept of innovation readiness level together with the consumer readiness level and the society readiness level. You know, it was such a striking thing that even the technologists, the entrepreneurs, they were thinking, that I need an anthropologist, a sociologist. What for? I mean, the best thing is the technology. This is the best product in the world. So the linkage to change, that the technology needs sometimes to change behavior, and to what extent they consider this is something which is crucial. We are just fighting every single day to create this kind of complementary things, that it is not only about engineers, it is also with all this kind of new mindset in order to consider the consumers that Andrew was saying before, no, the need. So this needs to be embedded in the innovation process as such.
Thank you, Elena. Let's go back to Andrew. I just want to ask Andrew, obviously, you know, consumers having enough information in front of them, making, you know, informed judgments, all those sorts of things. Obviously, there's a big issue with the big T word, trust, isn't there, right now? And disinformation and technology, if we look at that, it has a big part of our lives. And there has been sort of a lack of trust in technology because of certain things happening over recent years, right?
Sure, absolutely. Whether you trust information depends where it comes from. It's called source credibility, and it's very, very important. But, you know, we can trust companies when they tell us things. I think another issue related to what Tommaso said and to what your question is actually, you know, consumers don't want to be overloaded with information. You know, if you think of the range of things we buy and consume, we don't want perfect information on it all. So, you know, that rational decision-making process is never really going to happen.
But in terms of technology, do you think some companies are then taking advantage of that and doing stuff with technology that people, if they knew about it, probably wouldn't like?
Inevitably, we know that the way that your data is used by a lot of companies, lots of companies operate very ethically, but it's very, very opaque to the consumer. We know that from research, that most consumers have very limited understanding of how that data is used. They know that pop-ups happen and ads and have some kind of idea, but they don't really have, not surprisingly, don't have an in-depth idea of how that whole world of consumer analytics actually works and how it presents things to them. So yes.
Okay, thanks. Annelies, did you want to say something? Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm what Elena said. I think that's really important. We have to have a much more systemic look at innovation, and not just focus on a small technical innovation, but also take account of side effects and so on, and we try to do that also in our activities, and I think that's very important, and that means that you need different actors to work on an issue, and in a transdisciplinary way, and that's very important, I think, for the future, that we really have a systemic side on these things.
Annelies, just stay with me. I mean, obviously, when we look at the future of technology and innovation across various different sectors, it relies, doesn't it, on strong collaboration between the sort of public and private sectors. Obviously, you know, Swissway, you're the CEO, it's a federal innovation agency, and you're working with SMEs and startups, particularly in the science sector. You know, we've been hearing for years that the two should work closer together, but in reality, are governments and private companies really working that closely together? I mean, how do you make that happen in Switzerland?
Well, that's exactly our vision. So we bring the science sector and the private sector together. So we are fostering, especially at SMEs and startups, of course, and we finance innovation projects that are jointly executed by research institutes and SMEs. That's not that easy, because that are different worlds, and especially SMEs very often are a little bit intimidated by the huge science sector, by professors and their word. And we help them to come together and do the work. And I think in the end, it's very beneficial for both sides. And you may know we have really good universities in Switzerland. We have a lot of scientific outcome, and we really have to make use of this outcome for the benefit of these SMEs, for the companies, but also in a broader sense for society. That's our mission.
And,
okay.
and Damon, if I may add to that, Annalise is totally right. I mean, especially small startups and in the tech and science industries are very important. I mean, if I think about how our own innovation and how it came to life, and it's the heating tobacco system that really is breaking through worldwide at the moment, it's really the result of work with dozens of startups in the Neuchâtel area, because they're the ones who could come even better than us up with the technology that is needed to develop something so sophisticated. So I totally agree. And it's an ecosystem that needs to be created to be successful. It's not just one company.
But Tommaso, a lot of your R&D and research has been done in-house, right? You're not doing much with independent researchers, are you?
Actually, we do. So there's product development, which is what I was referring to, and then there's science to validate the risk reduction potential of our smoke-free products. That science is in large part financed by us, but that's absolutely how science works. 70% of science worldwide is financed by companies like us, says the OECD.
Why would a consumer trust you then?
Well, let me get there. How do you trust the science on vaccines? Because that science, although it's paid by pharma companies, is subject to good clinical practices, good laboratory practices, exactly the same standards that we apply to our own research, because that's how research works. But regardless of that, and the fact that science needs to be trusted in general, because there are standards in place for any science, regardless of who finances it, there's actually a lot of independent research that's being conducted on smoke-free products, including our own IQOS. I mean, only on IQOS, and I cite our product because I don't want to talk about others, there's between 70 and 80 independent studies that confirm important elements of our research. Some of those come from the Food and Drug Administration in the US, BFR, the Institute for Consumer Protection in Germany, the equivalent of BFR in the Netherlands. And I'm just citing 3 or 4, but I could go on with dozens of those. So it's a bit of a myth, both the idea that science, when financed by companies, needs to be biased. That's not necessarily the case, because science has very strict protocols in place. And the second myth is that the science is only financed by us. It's not true. There's a lot of independent science out there. And we talked about the role of governments. Well, governments should review science and should give confidence about the quality of the science, exactly what Public Health England is doing in the UK for e-cigarettes, and what the Food and Drug Administration is doing when it comes to innovative tobacco products in the US.
Okay, Andrew, Professor of Consumer Behaviour at Nottingham University Business School. I guess the science aspect of innovation and public good, I mean, that's really been thrown in the limelight with the pandemic, right? I mean, there's been a lot of government scientists, for example, that have become celebrities overnight, and people have been glued to their TV screens waiting for the update on where the pandemic's going and what's going to happen next. Do you think the public are now looking much more closely at the science and the facts behind innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a social scientist, so I'm going to come, a social and behavioural scientist, I'm going to come from that direction. Yeah, I think so. I think it's raised the profile of science generally, which is probably a good thing. Although there's probably some bad sides to that. You know, people could misinterpret some of the information that's out there, and scientists do have agendas. They don't all agree, and some of them will apply their agendas for their own, to reinforce their own viewpoint and their own standing. So yeah, I think that, I would echo something that Tommaso said about the collaboration between the private sector and the university sector in particular. We have a range of partners with the NLab. We work on how you use data really to encourage psychological well-being. These data streams that companies have to encourage social and individually beneficial psychological impacts. And we find that collaboration has just improved over the last 10, 15 years. And a lot of the boundaries between commerce and universities have really crumbled, to do with lots of factors, really. But I think it's a bit of a misnomer that there's this sort of barrier between the two at the moment. So I would certainly challenge that.
And just develop a little further on what you do then, actually, within the End Lab. I mean, what kind of things are you doing with companies?
Well, we have a number of collaborators, NGOs and companies, retailers and others. And we take the data streams they have, ethically, anonymized, and we show them ways in which they can use that to enhance people's health outcomes. So, for example, a food retailer, how they can analyze nutritional scores in a way that can help them understand the lifestyles of their customers, so they can help to benefit, not in sort of crude ways, but in subtle ways. And if you can be concerned about your customers' well-being. It's quite possible to be concerned about that. If you're concerned about it, there are ways that a lot of the data streams that you collect can help you understand it and help them be more healthy.
Okay.
Yeah. If I can jump a comment. I mean, you know that my company is supported by the EIT, the European Institute of Technology. This body was funded by the European Commission to foster exactly innovation. And I think that sometimes we think that it is very easy to go from research to innovation, to go to the market. And here there is the mortality rate is huge, because one thing is to have the knowledge and the technology, and the other the capacity to execute and the capacity to reach it to the market. So it is quite a complex, and still we find a lot of drawbacks and a lot of complications, because there is a huge gap between where sometimes the knowledge is created and where to move that knowledge onto the market. And just
but that's not a new problem, though, is it?
No, but it is still a problem, because for instance, Andrew is a professor. I would like to ask him, in your KPIs, your dean is asking you about any innovation that you have taken to the market, or still in the academia we are focused on publications, index factor, and all these kind of things?
I will happily answer that question. We're not just focused on publications. We have, I mean, I don't want to be parochial here, but in the UK, we're assessed on research in terms of impact, and we have things called impact case studies, and those are often about social and health impacts and general social impacts, and we're measured. Some of our public funding comes from how we're assessed in terms of how our research impacts the world.
And Elena, in terms of the work that you're doing in the energy transition and the climate sector, I mean, how do you measure the impact of your work? Because, as I say, I mean, you're working in a very topical global issue right now, where a lot of eyes are on you, particularly with the COP event coming up in Glasgow. I mean, how do you assess that actually the innovation that you're fostering through your company, which is supported by an EU agency, how do you measure the impact and actually think, yeah, this is the right thing to do for the public?
Measuring impact is very complicated because there is no standard, but we choose a methodology that somehow for us sustainability, measuring impact, means the environmental aspect, the social aspect, and the economic aspects. And then what we do, for instance, with our portfolio companies, that at this moment we have near 200 companies in our portfolio, is to measure the impact in those aspects. For instance, just one example, we were saying that we are focused on energy transition, and this means more affordable, more accessible, and more sustainable. So are we doing in a good direction? The environmental, CO2 reduction. So the portfolio of these early stage companies, because these are very innovators, coming many of them from the research part. The projections or the potential is that in the year 2030, they will be able to have the potential to reduce 1.1 gigaton. This means taking off the road 250 million of cars. Okay, so that is why how important innovation is. Accessibility. I mean, in the year 2030, we are talking about more than 350,000 households to get access in developing countries to electricity. Or we are talking in terms of cost, reducing the cost, making more affordable. In the year 2030, these companies, early stage, have the potential to reduce costs by 9.1 billion. This is in terms of environmental, also social, but this goes accompanied with the economic aspect. And that is where we link with the profit aspect. If really you are focusing on impact and you are answering great questions, money comes. And that is why, for instance, what we are looking for is that these companies, for instance, they will have the potential in the year 2030 to be around 73 billion in terms of revenues. This is what today is Luxembourg gross national product. So this is measuring is not easy because we have to have a devoted team specifically just measuring impact. But for us, that is what it drives us, not the benefits, not the profits. But we know that if we fulfill the impact, profits will come.
Okay, Lena, thank you very much indeed. If you're just joining us, welcome along to this Euronews debate. It's called Profit versus Public Good. And the question we're asking is, how can innovation benefit everyone? If you do have a question for any of our panelists, do leave that in the comment section, and we'll get that over to our panelists before we finish up in about 20 minutes or so. Tommaso, PMI, let's go back to you in Switzerland. We talk about sort of measuring impacts, that this kind of, looking at the public good that genuinely does come out of technology and innovation. What kind of conversations are happening in boardrooms at private companies about profit versus public good?
In our company is, can we marry both? So actually we are more sustainable while we continue to grow and get ahead of our competitors. And we realize that the more we can do both things at the same time, the more we will be successful, and we will pose a solid basis for the future. I mean, if you think about our company, for instance, we really measure our success. There's two parameters that we consider key. One is, in how many countries do we have smoke-free products available? Because it's not easy. It depends on a lot of circumstances, including, we mentioned regulation, but also consumer readiness. And we're already at 67 countries where our heated tobacco system and other products that are smoke-free are available. And the second is, how many smokers are we getting away from cigarettes and into those new products? And how many of them actually really abandon cigarettes, like they leave them behind, because that's when they get the full potential health benefit of the product. And there we already are beyond 20 million smokers who adopted the product, and 15 million, i.e. approximately 73%, who have completely abandoned cigarettes. And that's quite unprecedented, so it makes us very proud. And then, of course, it's what does it take to go totally smoke-free, to really get rid of cigarettes? And that's when the conversation becomes a bit more complex, I would say.
Okay, and on this issue of profit versus public good, one of our viewers, Kenneth Krieger, thank you very much indeed for your comment, saying businesses need profit so their workers can do that public good. So that kind of supports what some of we've been hearing this afternoon during this discussion. Annelies, I'd like to go back to you at InnoSwiss in Switzerland, the Swiss Innovation Agency. When I say the word regulation, some people might go, oh, regulation. But it's an important issue, isn't it, regulation? What's the sort of balance between having regulation that encourages innovation and technology, but then on the other side doesn't stifle it?
Well, I think that's a really challenging issue. On the one hand, you have to have the right framework conditions. So this is also security in society, but also, for example, a good university system. That's important. The workforce is important. The tax system is important. So framework condition is certainly important. But on the other hand, you also have, as I already said, you have to have regulation that prevents harmful effects of certain developments. And I think this is a steady challenge for governments to have a smart regulation. You can't never say, so we got the thing, now we know how it works. You have to adapt and you have to correct all the time and see what the effects are.
Okay, Annelies, we did a little social media poll of our own before this debate, asking the question to our audiences: do you think more regulation is needed in order to ensure technology serves the public good? And everybody that responded to that said yes, they do think that more regulation is needed to ensure that technology does serve the public good. Andrew, do you go along with that? Consumers do think about regulation and how these things are protected?
Yeah, they won't necessarily think about the detail. I think there's lots of issues, particularly with digital virtual goods and social media, and people are very well aware of them. There are lots of externalities. There are obvious mental health impacts from using social media. Some of that research has been suppressed, it seems, by some of the social media providers. So yeah, I think people are concerned. It's sort of, we sometimes can't control our own behaviour, and we need regulation to help us stop our own behaviour becoming sort of harmful to ourselves and others. So yeah, absolutely, the whole digital space needs regulation, and I think people appreciate that. It can't be a complete Wild West situation where absolutely anything goes for your own good and for the good of others.
Okay,
now, Damon, if I may, on this point, I think the question is also, is it, besides more or less regulation, it's what type of regulation? Because you can have more regulation but actually create an obstacle to innovation, or vice versa. And I think instead it's what type of regulation. And I think regulations should create incentives for companies to pursue the public good. And the more they do that, the more I think companies will have, to the point we made before, which is companies actually in the end look for profit. The more you create a way to marry profit and public good through regulation, the more you will see that regulation, that innovation coming through. So I think it's also a matter of quality of regulation.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Tommaso.
Damon, if I can work on Tommaso, I completely agree with him, because it depends on what type of legislation. The legislation should help to create the market conditions for the innovation. And sometimes, for instance, in a very regulated market, for instance, a US venture, to have the same size of the market than a European one, the European one has to deal with 28 different legislations. That is impossible in terms of scalability. And sometimes the scalability is the key to get affordability, so that it can be purchased and it can be acquired by the public. So sometimes the legislation is perfect. For instance, everything that has to do with the new Green Deal, when the European Commission was pushing, has made very positive aspect in terms of innovators. In these, US innovators are coming to Europe to innovate, which is a surprise, because usually it's the vice versa, the other journey. But for instance, sometimes it can prevent innovation from happening at the speed that it should become. So it can totally kill it. So it depends.
It can be a bureaucratic nightmare by the sounds of it. Yeah, indeed. Elena, just stay with me. I'm just going to take some questions now from our audience, just for the final time that we have in this debate this afternoon. Thanks to everyone for watching, and thanks for sending in your questions. I'm going to ask as many as I can. Quick fire now to our panelists. Elena, SR Dane has sent in a question saying, how do you envisage trust and compliance in terms of data usage in the future?
Data usage. So that data usage is not specifically my topic, but trust.
But I guess in most sectors are collecting data these days, right?
Yes, but especially for instance with the logarithms, all these kind of software type of solutions. That is complex because we need the regulation. That is true. In this case, it is very important to know, for instance, who owns the data, for what exactly, what is the trust, and probably we need certified bodies that somehow they very renowned certifications, that they have the stamp to the consumer that their data is safe, it is used for what it is needed. But still is there a Pandora box. I mean, I think that especially when we have innovators that they are using algorithms and all these kind of things, when you ask, but who owns the data? Oh, question mark. That is where, for instance, the legislation still has a lot to do.
Okay, I'd like to move on to the next question. Tommaso, this one is definitely for you. It mentions PMI in the question. Should PMI no longer sell to young people, 21 and below, for example, to prevent new smokers from starting in the first place?
Well, first of all, we actually don't intend our products to minors in general. Now, that age, of course, varies country by country, and we usually respect the laws of the countries when it comes to that. In this case, 21 is the minimum age in some countries, and of course we respect it. In other countries it's 18. There are some countries where the age is actually lower, and in those countries we set the bar at 18 anyway, because we don't believe minors should be having access to products that contain nicotine and that are still harmful. Although even the better ones, even the ones that are smoke-free, still have some risks, so minors shouldn't have access to them. Then look, besides us, of course, there's the role of governments, of trade to prevent minors from having access. But on our end, we do everything we can. For instance, people may not know it, but we actually run all our consumer initiatives through a round of scrutinies internally to make sure that they don't appeal to minors. That's something we do. And if you think about it, if ever it happened and minors really have significant access to our products, it would be an issue for us as well, for a number of reasons. First, ethically. Second, in terms of reputation. And to conclude, when it comes to IQOS, we're actually very encouraged because the Food and Drug Administration has set monitoring of adoption. And in their assessment of the evidence we provided, they clearly said there is very little interest from minors in the product, which we're proud of. And in Switzerland, we had similar findings, so in Germany, so in Japan. So we're very happy of that trend.
Okay, Tommaso, thank you very much indeed. That question was from Innovation Spotlight, so hopefully that answered your question from Tommaso there at PMI. Andrew Smith, a question for you, I think. This is on the sort of consumer side. This one comes in saying, how can big companies create more trust with everyday people about their innovation initiatives and intentions?
Well, by being open about them and by incorporating, by considering well-being from the very individual consumer and societal well-being from the very start when they innovate products, and then they'll build up a track record that will engender trust. So you've got to think about these things. You can't retrofit them. And I think that's Tommaso's problem to some extent with the legacy. If you've got a new innovation, you've got to incorporate how it's going to affect consumers' well-being and society in general right from the beginning. What are the effects of that going to be? And as people see that you've sort of programmed the thing with those things, and they see that works, and they see that has certain benefits or reduces harms, then that will engender trust. It's also how you communicate that as well. You have to do it in clear ways that the consumers actually want, not sort of obfuscated or weird ways.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew. Let's go back to Anneliese Eggermann at InnoSwiss in Switzerland. One for you. Yeah, it's about VAT and tax. What about VAT in terms of innovation? So I guess Kiki, who sent in this question, is getting at sort of the fiscal and tax regimes and the VAT regimes that are in place. How do you think that plays with innovation?
Well, I'm not a specialist in taxes, I must say, so maybe I'm not the right person to answer this. But I think companies that innovate should get a kind of a privilege for innovating, and afterwards it depends on the product they put on the market, whether you have to pay TVA or whatever. So I think, but for the innovation process, I think it's important that also the state, the public sector gives some incentives on this.
Okay, all right. Let's go back to Elena at EIT.
No, just a comment for the taxes aspect.
Are you a tax expert?
No, but that's an innovative idea, because sometimes we are looking at the government about the taxes. Why not to have incentive also on the citizens to invest in innovation? So it is not only the consumer role, it is not only the customer role, it is not only the co-producer type of role, but also the investor. And I think that would be very relevant in order to democratize a lot, not only in the usage and in the market, but also as the financial perspective. So it is a different perspective, because sometimes we only point at the government about the taxes, but they can have incentive also for us, you and me, my mother, anybody, to invest our savings in innovation. Crowdfunding is one example. Why not?
You answered that question very confidently about government, so I'm going to ask you another one about governments, which has come in from our audience. Thank you very much indeed for sending this one in. How can European governments themselves become more innovative, e.g. through their agility, mindsets, digital skills, and be open-minded? I mean, does this all start at the root of everything with the governments themselves?
I think that being Europeans in the latest years, we should be proud that I think that the European governments are trying to be much more innovative. Okay, the only thing is that have you ever seen an elephant dance? So that is what we are discussing here, no? How a big body governance in order to be very innovative. But I think that they are leaving a space for companies to have this kind of freedom, a bit like, for instance, this kind of public-private partnership where they can a bit innovate in a more freedom type of atmosphere. And the other thing I think that which is crucial for innovation is that sometimes the government, they need to be the first launching customer. They need to be the first ones to say, hey, because at the end, the private companies are very risky when you say, do you want to innovate? Yeah, but who else is doing it? Okay. But then the government should be the first ones to say, hey, we are going to be the first ones to adopt the innovation and then allow the company to get the largest scale. This is something that it happened with the microchips in the US. In the 60s, one microchip was $32. After 10 years, in the 70s, it was $1.2. What it allows this industry to reduce so much the price and make it affordable was exactly that the government was not the creator of this technology, but he bought and he allowed the mass production of it. So I think that there is a good chances that they can be very innovative. So we have to put them in the equation.
Okay, Elena, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all of you in our audience that sent in questions this afternoon. We got around to as many as we could. Listen, we've just got a few minutes left before we break up from this debate. And I just want to ask each of you a final question. Try to keep it to about 20 or 30 seconds, and you'll keep me in my boss's good books about finishing on time. I'm going to ask you the question we've been asking today, profit versus public good. How can innovation benefit everyone? So Annelies Eggermann at InnoSwiss, profit and public good, is it possible?
It is definitely possible. I think it needs the good will from everybody to do it, but it's for me it's not a contrary, so but it's a necessity. And I think in our case we're here because we have the conviction that it is possible, and we want to foster that.
Okay, Tommaso from PMI, profit and public good, how do you make that happen?
A lot of goodwill, a lot of investments, and a lot of vision, I have to say, from our leadership. Those were key. And to go forward, I think we need probably everyone to play his or her role and embrace the power of science, technology, and innovation, also for tobacco and public health.
Okay, Elena Bo, EIT InnoEnergy, what do you think is going to be crucial going forward to ensure that there is profit, but there's also that tangible public good?
Yes, and in these two aspects, making good and doing good and making money is not an oxymoron anymore, but it is not so much about the storytelling, but about the story doing.
Okay, great, nice and concise. Andrew Smith, from a consumer perspective, how important is profit and public good, and is it possible from a consumer perspective?
Yes, I think it is. You give people things that fit in their lives, that are useful to them, but also take in consideration the effect on their individual psychology and wider social issues. And I think that's possible if you do it right from the start when you're innovating something.
Great stuff. Good. Andrew Smith, Professor of Consumer Behaviour and Director of the N Lab at Nottingham University Business School. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Nice to see you there. Thank you. Elena Bo was the Innovation Director at EIT InnoEnergy. She was joining us from Madrid in Spain for this conversation. Thanks, Elena, to you.
Thanks to you. Great discussion.
Also great to see Tommaso Di Giovanni, Vice President of International Communications at Philip Morris International, PMI in Lausanne in Switzerland. Thanks to you, Tommaso.
Thank you, actually, and thank you all, because this was a very interesting bouncing of ideas.
Thank you very much indeed for your valued contribution. And last but not least, thank you very much indeed to Annelies Eggermann, CEO of InnoSwiss, the Swiss innovation agency, who was joining us from Bern in Switzerland today. Thank you very much to you, Annelies.
Thank you.
Great, and thank you very much indeed to all of our audience for watching. It was a fascinating discussion, wasn't it, about the future of tech and innovation that affects all of us in our everyday lives, in terms of whether that's the energy transition, climate change, getting us moving again in travel. The pandemic with all the vaccine developments really does have a big impact on all of us right around the world. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you again soon for another Euronews Debate. Bye for now.